Ligonier Ministries, the teaching fellowship of R.C. Sproul, presents A Harmony of Differences, Real Men and Real Women, with Elisabeth Elliot. This message is entitled, A Real Man is a True Man.
This is the third talk in my series on real men and real women. And the title of this one is A True Man. Let me change that. The title of this one is A Real Man is a True Man. I don't know if any of you ever heard Gert Bahana. She was a wonderful old lady with a gravelly voice that had an incredible testimony. She hadn't become a Christian until she was in her 50s, I think, and it was when she was in her 70s that I heard her. And she gave a great talk way back before the feminist movement began called Women Be Women. And I remember very vividly, very distinctly, how she turned from talking to the women in the audience to the men, and she said, "And now I want to talk to you men, you lambs." And I thought, well, that's kind of the way I feel too. Men can be very overbearing and overpowering, and there are other times when they can be such lambs. And we women want you to be more than just lambs. We really don't want to be wearing the pants. Now, I think I speak for the majority of women when I say that. It's the women who keep their mouths shut that you don't hear from, and it's the women who are angry at men and determined to be competitive and make sure that we all get equality and all that sort of thing, that would be angry, very angry with me when they hear me say something like that. But I do think that I speak for the majority when I say that we really don't want to run things. We don't want to be in charge of the world. And having been a single woman, as I said, for most of my life, I am so grateful when I do have a husband, which I happen to have now. I'm so grateful that the buck does not stop at my desk. It stops with Lars's. He is the one who is responsible before God in the last analysis for our home and what goes on in our home. I, of course, in response to God, in obedience to God, am to be the responder to my husband. And I have a part to play, and a very important part. But in this third talk, I do want to talk to you men who were created to be the heads, the initiators, the protectors, the providers, the fathers, the lovers, and the friends of us women. You represent Christ. Now, where did I get that idea? Certainly not out of my head. Again, back to the scriptures. Ephesians 5, verse 21 says to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, every one of us has to be subject to others, men as well as women. We are subject to civil authorities. We are subject to the boss. We are subject to the authorities in the church. All of us, at some time or other, have the responsibility of being an authority over somebody, and always we are under authority as well. So I think this is what Paul is talking about here. Let's remember that those to whom we are to be subject, we must be subject out of reverence for Christ, not because the person is necessarily a better person than we are. And as I said earlier, in an earlier talk, I don't submit to my husband Lars because he is taller and stronger and bigger and better looking and more spiritual and more intelligent than I am. I am to submit to my husband because he bears an office which is assigned to him by God. I probably didn't say it in exactly those words, and I'm going to try to be more specific now that I'm talking to you men. But Ephesians 5 goes right on from, after all these warnings that he gives, let no one deceive you with shallow arguments, have no part or lot with them, try to find out what would please the Lord, show them up for what they are, be most careful how you conduct yourselves. I'm reading all of this from Ephesians 5. Do not be fools, try to understand the will of the Lord. And then immediately after all these warnings, the first thing he says is be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he goes on to specify the ways in which this subjection works, the specific ways in which he means what he's saying. Wives, be subject to your husbands because they are so spiritual. Is that what it says? It doesn't say that. It says, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For, and this is the reason why I'm to be subject, not because he's smart or always right, the man is the head of the woman, just as Christ is the head of the church. It doesn't say the man ought to be the head of the woman. He ought to try to be the head. The woman ought to allow him to be the head. They ought to sit down and take a vote as to who is going to be the head. What does it say? The husband is the head of the woman. Like it or lump it, that is the fact. As Christ is head of the church. I said earlier that a real man is a true man. A real woman is a true woman. And I cannot be a true woman except in obedience to Christ. You can't be a real man except in obedience to Christ. It is that universal response of the church, the bride of Christ. Let it happen as you say. Whatever you say, Lord, I'll do it. So the real man is the one who is utterly given over to God, one with him in his purpose, in his work, and in love. Now don't be discouraged, gentlemen. I am not saying you have to be a perfect man. Now God says we have to be perfect. And so I have to say we have to be perfect. And yet God in his mercy takes us exactly as we are, just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me. And that's how we come. And we have to start with one step of obedience. After saying, Lord, I receive you, I accept you, I take your will for my will, then God is going to show you something, some specific thing that you're supposed to do. Now don't expect God to give you a blueprint of your whole life and say, now this is your work for me, and these are the things in the serial order in which they are to occur. Very likely it's going to be something very, very simple and down to earth, like loving your wife in a way that you didn't love her before, or being kind to your parents, or making an apology to somebody at work, or writing that letter that you've been putting off for 3 years. Something like that is where it begins. But a man he is not a perfect man, and yet he is a man. And he's made by God, made in the image of God, and made to serve him. And he is a man under authority. I wish I had time to talk about all three of my husbands this morning. I've mentioned my husband, Lars Grin. Some of you know quite a bit about my first husband, Jim Elliot, about whom I wrote a biography. And one of the things that really clinched my conviction that this man, whom I knew as a college student, and I knew a lot of things about him, he was a campus leader and a campus joker, and he was a very good student, and he was president of the Foreign Missions Fellowship, and he was a champion wrestler and all those things. But the thing that really clinched it, and I said, this is the kind of man I want to marry, and Lord, this is the specific man I'd like to marry if you give him to me, was the verse that he chose to put into my yearbook when I asked for his autograph. And it was 2 Timothy 2:4. A soldier on active service will not become entangled in civilian affairs. He must be wholly at his commanding officer's disposal. And the thing that impressed me about what that young man said was that here was a college student, and this is a rare thing, it was a rare thing even then, and I think it's even rarer today, a college student who had made a final decision about one thing, and that was that Jesus Christ was his commanding officer, Lord of his life. And so Jim was letting me know in no uncertain terms that neither I nor anybody else nor anything was going to deflect him from that course that he had chosen, the will of God. A soldier on active service will not become entangled in civilian affairs. He must be wholly at his commanding officer's disposal. Now that's a real man. And the thing that all three of my husbands have had in common, people are always asking me this, were they alike in any ways? Well, not very many ways. One way, they all liked me, which is certainly nice. But the other outstanding similarity is that they were all real men in the sense of being a man's man. And I appreciate masculinity. And I don't know any real women who like being women who don't appreciate men who like to be men. And the more feminine we are, the more masculine we want you to be. We beg you to be. That's what I'm here for. That's what I want to tell you. And only as you are a man under authority, that is the authority of Christ, can you possibly exercise that awesome, divine authority that God has assigned to you. And whenever I get into discussions, as I try not to do anymore, but over the past years I've been in many, many discussions, and I've been asked to debate publicly and be on panels on this whole subject of masculinity and femininity, it always grieves me no end that people don't start with the mystery. Forget about equal rights, forget about the area of politics in which equality is a necessary evil. It's necessary. And it's a fiction. It's a legal fiction. But it is absolutely necessary that we be treated in the political realm as equals. But introduce political terms into the church or into the home, and you're in a slough. You're in an absolute swamp of uncertainty and just a mess, which I think is also one of the things that's responsible for the divorces nowadays and the chaos in the church, not to mention the homosexuality and the heterosexuality and the transsexuality. I mean, when I say heterosexuality, not that that's wrong, but the way in which heterosexuality is being exercised is not at all according to the scriptures. So a man must be under authority in order to exercise the authority which represents the mystery of Christ and the church. This is the crucial point. I've never heard it discussed in any arguments about the ordination of women, about who is supposed to be the head of the house, about women's roles in society. Never a word. And when I bring it up, I get a lot of people looking at me like, where did you come from? You know, some other planet? I mean, their eyes glaze. They don't know what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. Christ is the head of the church. Could there possibly be any confusion about that? He is our authority. He is the initiator. He's the one who calls us and woos us and gives his name, and above all, lays down his life in total sacrifice for us. So, the husband is the head of the woman as Christ is head of the church. Now, I heard a woman one time in a great, huge convention do a workshop on egalitarian marriage. And her proof text was this very passage. And she did some fancy footwork that would absolutely make your head spin. So, of course, when there was a question and answer period, you can be sure I had one. And I said, do you think it makes any difference at all? She had told us, of course, that the roles were equal, interchangeable, and everything else. I said, does it make any difference at all how a husband is to submit to his wife and a wife is to submit to her husband? Are they exactly the same in your mind? She said, they are exactly the same. I said, okay, may I then reverse the nouns in this passage? Yes, sure, go right ahead. So I started reading. Wives, love your husbands as Christ loved the church. The wife is the head of the husband as the church is the head of Christ. And she stopped me. She said, well, wait a minute, you can't carry the analogy that far. Well, I said, whose analogy was it? What does an analogy mean? The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. What does that mean? Well, I want to read to you a little story, and I just got this amazing little testimony called "Do You Love Me?" I just got this the other day, and I was reading it on the plane coming down yesterday, and I thought, I've got to read this passage from this man's testimony. This is a man who had 7 children, and they lost number 8, and he tells about what the loss of that baby, just through miscarriage, did. As he held this tiny baby in his hand, it changed his whole perspective on life and what his responsibility was to his family and everything else. And that's what the story is, and I can't read you all that. But he says, one of my friends, when confronted at the end of his long work day with his wife's complaints about the noise, the troubles, and the unending housework, snapped back at her in exasperation. "Well, what do you want me to do, stay home and do the housework while you go off to the office?" You understand his point. He couldn't solve her problems. What did she want him to do? I'll tell you. She wanted him to listen, to understand, and to sympathize. She wanted him to let her know that despite her problems, her exhaustion, her dishevelment, and who of us wives can't relate to that, he loved her. To let her know that it caused him sorrow that she was suffering, and that if it were possible, he would change it for her. That's all she wanted. And yet, that's everything. She knew as well as he did that hers are the perennial problems of wives and mothers, and that there is no avoiding them. These problems can't be eliminated or even really diminished in their frequency or their burdensome character. But we men can make them easier for women to bear. Jesus said, "Come to me, you who are tired and overburdened. I will give you rest." And that's what your wife wants. She's tired and overburdened. You can't understand why. You don't know what in the world she's been doing all day long when you've been working so hard. But she wants you to say, "Come to me, I love you, I will give you rest." A husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church. Now basically that means one word: sacrifice. And I choose that word rather than love, because love has become a soupy, sentimental, feeble, very much misunderstood sentiment. That's not the kind of love that Christ had for the church. It is a total sacrificial love. Bloody sacrifice is what it meant for him. And there will be no success in a marriage without sacrifice on both parts. When the bride comes down the aisle, she's not bathed in tears because she's giving up her name and her home and her independence and her autonomy and perhaps her family and her whole geography and everything else. She comes down the aisle radiant with joy because there is a face down there that she loves. And all these other things are trivialities by comparison. I love him. I will make any sacrifice. That's what she thinks on the wedding day. And then, of course, where the rubber meets the road is when she finds out that this prize package that she got is a surprise package. And from the day of the wedding, she has to love him because she married him. And the same thing is true of you men. Husbands, love your wives. And I love what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:7, try to understand the wives you live with. I dare say that that's an admission on Peter's part that he didn't really fully understand his wife, let alone his mother-in-law, and we know that his mother-in-law lived with him too. But he says try. Now, how much have you tried? This little testimony that I have here is a man who just did a complete about-face after, I've forgotten how many years of marriage, and began to try. In fact, let me read what he says specifically. He said, in that critical instant, as he was looking at the infant cradled in his hands, I chose the arduous, undramatic, discouraging path of trying to be good. I began holding my tongue. I started admitting my faults and apologizing. I quit defending myself when I was judged too harshly. As I had made myself the center of my attention for too many years already. I said little about my own labors and sorrows. I sought to know Susan's and to help her bear them. You are to exhibit the love of Christ for his bride, for your wife. Now, I've asked the question, why am I as a wife to submit to my husband? It is because he bears an office. You bear a solemn responsibility in that office. It's God's assignment. It's not your choice. And I know a lot of men that say, well, you know, my wife's really better at organizing things, and she's much more spiritual than I am, so I let her handle the family devotions, and, you know, I don't feel comfortable being the head of the house. God did not make it optional. Now, a lot of us women are naturally manipulators and organizers. In fact, not to make any case for purgatory, I love what C.S. Lewis said about purgatory as he imagined it. He said, I imagine it as a place where milk is boiling over, toast is burning, and crockery is being smashed. The assignment given to women is to do nothing, and the assignment given to men is to do something. And I think that ever since the Garden of Eden, that this has been characteristic. Men would much rather be laid back, you know, they'd rather go down and bowl and let the women do whatever they want to do, even if it's against their will. And the women want to get organized and fix things and, you know, stop the crockery from smashing and the toast from burning and the milk from boiling over. God did not leave the choice with either of us. He tells me to shut my mouth, back off, submit to my husband. And he tells you husbands, you are responsible. Who was it that God called in the garden after the fruit had been eaten? Not Eve, Adam. And what did Adam do? Right away started making excuses. The woman you gave me. Are you tempted that way, gentlemen? An archetype. Besides Adam, who was laid back and abdicated his responsibility, the archetype in the New Testament is Jesus, of course. But let's also look at the life of Joseph. Almost nothing is said about the character of Joseph, but what he did reveals quite a bit about his character. Surely he used the strength that God had given him not to rule and lord it over and be boss of that little Mary. He used it to love and to protect her, to serve her. We know that Joseph was a laborer. He worked with his hands. He probably did much more difficult work than many men nowadays ever think of doing. He was physically strong. He was morally strong. He was charged with the heavy responsibility of mothering this virgin who was pregnant by the Holy Ghost, and then with the responsibility of fathering, in the earthly sense, that baby. Now, if you ask yourself this, you husbands and fathers, if you were given Joseph's job, literally to mother the Virgin Mary and to father the Lord Jesus, would you do the job differently than the way you're doing it now? Now, Jesus said, inasmuch as you have done it for one of the least of these my brothers, you have done it for me. In other words, whatever I do to another human being, I do to Christ. And whatever I refuse to do to another human being, I refuse to do to Christ. My plane yesterday was 4 hours delayed getting out of Boston, and they ended up finally putting us on a different plane. And I have no doubt that God had a lot of reasons for that. He's engineering a universe, but one little glimpse of how God works things out was that I was seated next to a man who wanted to talk. And I gave him this little leaflet to read. since I had just finished reading it, and he began to tell me that his own experience was almost exactly the same, and it had come through a catastrophe in his own life. And we were talking about how different, he was telling me how differently he treated his wife and children since his business had collapsed. I don't know what it may take for men in this modern world to come to their senses, but so often it does take some kind of a catastrophe for us women as well. We're not paying any attention. As C.S. Lewis says, pain is God's megaphone to get our attention. Will you think about the example of Joseph? Then think of the example of Jesus. In Luke 22, you remember that Jesus is talking to his disciples about the fact that he's going to be betrayed and he is going his appointed way, and a jealous dispute broke out about who was going to be the first among the disciples. And Jesus says, "In the world, kings lord it over their subjects, and those in authority are called their country's benefactors. Not so with you. On the contrary, the highest among you must bear himself like the youngest, the chief of you like a servant. Yet here am I among you like a servant." And in John 13, we have that beautiful scene where Jesus rises from supper and takes a towel and washes the disciples' feet. And Peter's reaction was just what yours and mine would have been. "You, Lord, washing my feet?" And he said, "If I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you must wash one another's feet." That is the authority, the headship of Christ. Humble, sacrificial servanthood. He did not abdicate the position of Lord and Master. He said, "If I am your Lord and Master," which he certainly was, "and I'm washing feet, this is what I want you to do." Now, Jesus was on his way to the cross. And we can get all sorts of highfalutin and high-flown ideas about what we'd like to do for God. And I can imagine that some of those disciples might have imagined being crucified, perhaps. And legend says that some of them were. But Jesus was telling them one thing that every one of them could do. I'm going to the cross. I am going to be captured and spit upon and flogged and nailed to a cross. Your job, this is what love is. And it says in that first part of John 13, in order to show them the full extent of his love, he washed feet. Do you love God? In order to show the full extent of your love and to bear in humble obedience the authority that God has given to you as leaders, fathers, responsible heads in the world and in the church, you must be servants. You must lay down your life. Well, a husband said to me when he was on the road to divorce, "She won't submit to me." I said, I have never found a verse in the Bible that says, "Husbands, make your wives submit." God says clearly to me, I am to submit. And I've heard wives say, "But my husband doesn't love me as Christ loved the church. How can I submit to him?" So what do we have? A permanent standoff. She won't submit to me. He doesn't love me right. Well, we are miserable offenders, aren't we? We have left undone those things which we ought to have done. We have done those things which we ought not to have done. And there's no health in any of us. And a sinful man and a sinful woman, if they're going to live together 365 days a year, they're going to sin against each other. And there's going to have to be a lot of, "I'm sorry, forgive me." Your wife is weak and sinful. That means you need more patience, more tenderness, more kindness, more sacrifice, the weaker and the more sinful she is. You need to learn to listen to bear her sorrows, to be faithful and tender and gentle and humble, just like Jesus. He said, "Learn of me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." And don't ever forget that Jesus is exactly like God. "He that hath seen me hath seen the Father." Well, this mystery. Why am I to submit to my husband? Because he bears an office. Because I represent the church in the deepest mystery we know anything about. And why is my husband to be my head? Because he represents Christ. It's a drama being enacted in the home, a theater in which the cast of characters has already been decided upon. The wife represents the church, the husband represents Christ. In glorious acceptance, joyful obedience to our respective and quite different roles, we will find fulfillment in marriage, fulfillment in our masculinity, fulfillment in our femininity. A true man is a real man. A real man mirrors the character of God. A true woman is a real woman and mirrors the character of the bride of Christ. God bless you.
We hope you've enjoyed this series. If you're interested in other series by Elisabeth Elliot or would like more information about Ligonier Ministries, please call us toll-free at 1-800-435-4343 or write us at P.O. Box 54 7500, Orlando, Florida 32854.